The silence in the Afghan mountains was deafening, broken only by the whistle of wind through jagged rocks and the distant echo of gunfire. Sarah Mitchell crouched behind a boulder, her hands trembling as she gripped the M110 sniper rifle that belonged to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez just minutes before. Through the scope, she could see the militant preparing to fire a rocket-propelled grenade at her trapped teammates below. One shot, one chance, one decision that would shatter everything. She thought she knew about herself. 3 years of carrying cameras instead of weapons, 3 years of promises to her mother, 3 years of running from the legacy that flowed through her veins like mountain water. But sometimes the river finds its way to the sea, no matter how many rocks you place in its path. Sometimes the camera girl has to become something else entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell adjusted the strap of her camera bag as she approached the briefing room at Camp Riverside, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the polished concrete floor. The Colorado morning air still clung to her uniform, crisp and thin at 7,000 feet elevation, reminding her of the ranch mornings back in Billings. She was 15 minutes early, as always, but the expressions on the faces of the soldiers already gathered around the metal table made her feel like she'd stumbled into a private conversation she wasn't meant to hear. Sergeant Brad Coleman looked up from his tactical map and rolled his eyes dramatically. "Outstanding. They're sending the picture lady on this one too." His voice carried across the room with the kind of casual dismissal that Sarah had learned to ignore, though it still stung like the Montana wind on exposed skin. A few of the younger soldiers snickered, their nervous energy manifesting in the cruel humor that military personnel often use to mask their own anxieties about dangerous missions. Sarah found an empty chair against the back wall and began unpacking. Her equipment, her movements precise and practiced despite the hostile atmosphere. Her camera case contained over $30,000 worth of advanced tactical documentation equipment, gear that could capture high-definition footage from distances that most soldiers couldn't even see clearly with the naked eye. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same men who questioned her presence on combat missions couldn't operate a quarter of the technology she carried effortlessly into hostile territory. The 3rd Infantry Division's Bravo Company had a reputation for taking on the most challenging reconnaissance assignments along the Afghan border, and Sarah had been documenting their operations for nearly 3 years. Her footage had been used to train thousands of soldiers, analyze enemy tactics, and improve operational procedures that had undoubtedly saved lives. But to many of the combat personnel, she remained simply the camera girl, an unnecessary addition to missions that required speed, stealth, and lethal precision. Private Kevin Nash leaned back in his chair and stage whispered to his buddy, "Think she'll get some good vacation photos while we're getting shot at?" The comment drew another round of chuckles from the younger soldiers, though Sarah noticed that the more experienced veterans remained focused on their pre-mission preparations. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the team's designated marksman, glanced up from cleaning his rifle and gave Nash a look that could have frozen the Arkansas River in July. The laughter died quickly. Sarah continued her equipment check with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous missions. Her role as a visual documentation specialist required her to maintain camera systems under extreme conditions while staying close enough to combat operations to capture useful intelligence footage. It was a job that demanded technical expertise, physical endurance, and nerves of steel, even though military regulations strictly prohibited her from carrying weapons. She was there to observe and record, not to participate in combat operations. The path that had led her to this moment began on a cattle ranch outside Billings, Montana, where the Mitchell family had worked the same land for 4 generations. Her father, Robert Mitchell, was a Vietnam veteran who had served 2 tours with the Army Rangers before returning home to raise cattle and children with equal measures of discipline and love. The ranch sprawled across 200 acres of rolling grassland backed by the dramatic peaks of the Bertooth Mountains, and it was there that Sarah had learned to shoot. Bobby Mitchell believed that every member of his family should know how to handle firearms safely and accurately. Living 40 miles from the nearest sheriff's station meant that self-reliance wasn't just a philosophy, it was a practical necessity. By the age of 12, Sarah could hit a target at 300 yards with her father's old hunting rifle, and by 16, she was the Montana state champion in high school rifle competition. Her natural eye for precision, combined with an intuitive understanding of wind patterns and ballistics, had made her nearly unbeatable in regional competitions. But shooting paper targets at state championships felt like a lifetime ago as Sarah sat in that briefing room, surrounded by soldiers who saw her as a liability rather than an asset. Her father had taught her that marksmanship was about more than accuracy. It was about responsibility, discipline, and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Those lessons had shaped every choice she'd made since leaving the ranch, including the choice to carry cameras instead of rifles into combat zones. The decision to become a documentation specialist rather than pursuing infantry or sniper training had been born from a tragedy that changed everything for the Mitchell family. Tyler Mitchell, Sarah's older brother by 3 years, had enlisted immediately after high school with dreams of following their father's military legacy. He was charismatic, fearless, and absolutely convinced that he was destined to become a career soldier like Bobby had been. Tyler made it through basic training, advanced infantry school, and 2 successful deployments to Iraq before his luck ran out on a dusty road outside Kandahar. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The improvised explosive device had been buried deep enough to avoid detection by the convoy's mine detection equipment, and positioned with the kind of tactical precision that suggested professional military training among the insurgents. When Tyler's vehicle hit the pressure plate, the explosion was powerful enough to flip the 7-ton armored truck completely over. 3 soldiers died instantly, and Tyler survived only because he was thrown clear of the vehicle during the initial blast. The cost of his survival was his right arm, severed cleanly just below the shoulder by flying debris. Sarah received the phone call from Walter Reed Medical Center while she was in her sophomore year at Montana State University, studying photography and dreaming of becoming a National Geographic photographer. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional, explaining that Tyler was stable, but that his military career was over. The family would need to come to Washington immediately to begin making decisions about his long-term care and rehabilitation. The flight from Billings to Washington, D.C. was the longest 4 hours of Sarah's life. Her mother, Linda Mitchell, clutched a rosary in her lap and stared out the airplane window with the hollow expression of someone whose worst fears had finally materialized. Linda had lost her own father in Korea when she was just 7 years old, and the prospect of military service had always terrified her. She had supported Tyler's decision to enlist because she loved him and wanted him to pursue his dreams. But the cost of that support was measured in sleepless nights and constant worry. Bobby Mitchell sat beside his wife in stoic silence, his weathered hands folded in his lap as he processed the reality that his son would never be the soldier he had dreamed of becoming. The ranch had always been intended as Tyler's inheritance, a place where he could return after his military service to raise his own family and continue the Mitchell tradition. Now those plans lay in ruins, scattered like the metal fragments that had torn through his son's body on a road halfway around the world. Walking into Tyler's hospital room was like stepping into a nightmare that Sarah couldn't wake up from. Her brother, who had always been larger than life, looked small and fragile against the white hospital sheets. Machines monitored his vital signs with electronic precision, and the empty sleeve pinned to his hospital gown served as a stark reminder of how quickly everything could change. But it was the look in Tyler's eyes that broke Sarah's heart. The confident young man who had left Montana with dreams of military glory had been replaced by someone who wasn't sure who he was supposed to be anymore. The months that followed were a blur of medical appointments, rehabilitation sessions, and difficult conversations about the future. Tyler's physical recovery progressed steadily, but the psychological adjustment to his new reality proved much more challenging. He struggled with depression, phantom pain, and a sense of purposelessness that no amount of family support seemed able to address. The young man who had once been able to handle any physical challenge now needed help with basic tasks that he had taken for granted his entire life. It was during one of those long hospital visits that Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her military career. She was sitting beside Tyler's bed, watching him struggle to eat dinner with his left hand, when he looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I never got to prove myself," he said quietly. "I never got to show Dad that I could be the soldier he was. I never got to make a difference." Sarah took her brother's remaining hand and made him a promise that would haunt her for years to come. "I'll serve," she told him. "I'll carry on the family tradition. But I'll do it in a way that won't break Mom's heart any more than it's already broken." Tyler squeezed her hand with what strength he had and nodded his understanding. It was a moment of connection between siblings who had always been close, but it was also the moment when Sarah began running from her own potential. Enlisting as a visual documentation specialist allowed Sarah to serve her country while minimizing the risk of combat injury that had devastated her family. Her photography background made her a natural fit for the role, and her physical conditioning from years of ranch work meant she could keep up with combat units during extended operations. It seemed like the perfect compromise. She could honor her father's military legacy while keeping the promise she had made to Tyler and her mother. The training had been demanding but manageable. Sarah learned to operate advanced camera systems, tactical communications equipment, and field documentation protocols that would allow her to capture intelligence-grade footage under extreme conditions. She studied military tactics not to participate in combat operations, but to understand them well enough to position herself for optimal documentation opportunities. Her instructors were impressed by her natural ability to read battlefield situations and anticipate where the most important action would occur. But it was during advanced training at the Mountain Warfare School that Sarah's true abilities began to surface in ways that made her instructors take notice. The school's curriculum included basic marksmanship training for all personnel, regardless of their primary military occupation. The reasoning was simple. In mountain combat environments, every soldier might need to defend themselves, and accurate shooting could mean the difference between life and death when backup was hours or days away. Sarah approached the marksmanship training with the same methodical precision she brought to her camera work, expecting to perform adequately enough to meet minimum standards without drawing attention to herself. She had deliberately avoided mentioning her competitive shooting background during the enlistment process, fearing that it might lead to pressure to pursue combat roles that would violate her promise to her family. The first time she fired the standard-issue M4 carbine on the mountain warfare range, every shot landed within the center ring of targets positioned at distances that challenged even experienced infantry soldiers. Her breathing technique was flawless, her stance was textbook perfect, and her trigger control demonstrated the kind of muscle memory that typically took years to develop. The range instructor, a grizzled sergeant with 20 years of experience training mountain fighters, stopped the exercise and called Sarah aside. "Mitchell," he said, studying her target through binoculars, "where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah explained about the ranch, her father's training, and her high school competition experience, downplaying her abilities as much as possible while remaining truthful. The instructor nodded thoughtfully and made notes in her training file. That would follow her throughout her military career. The next day, Sarah found herself assigned to an advanced marksmanship course that was typically reserved for soldiers pursuing sniper qualification or special operations training. She tried to decline the assignment, explaining that her role as a documentation specialist didn't require advanced shooting skills, but her protests were overruled by training command. Every soldier needs to be prepared for any situation. The instructor explained, and you've got natural talent that would be wasted if we don't develop it properly. For 2 weeks, Sarah trained alongside soldiers who were destined for the most elite combat roles in the military. She learned advanced ballistics, range estimation, and precision shooting techniques that far exceeded anything her father had taught her on the ranch. Her performance consistently ranked in the top 5% of the class, and several instructors suggested that she consider transferring to sniper training or special operations programs. But Sarah remained committed to her chosen path, despite the growing recognition of her shooting abilities. She completed the mountain warfare training with commendations for both her documentation skills and her marksmanship performance. Then, reported to her first duty assignment with the firm intention of never touching a rifle again unless absolutely required for training purposes. The 3rd Infantry Division's Bravo Company became her new home, and Sarah threw herself into mastering every aspect of combat documentation. She learned to anticipate tactical movements, position herself for optimal footage capture, and operate her equipment under conditions that would have challenged professional photographers in civilian settings. Her work quickly gained recognition from intelligence analysts who praised the quality and tactical value of her documentation, but respect from distant analysts didn't translate to acceptance from the soldiers she worked alongside in the field. Many of the combat personnel viewed her as a non-essential addition to missions that were already dangerous enough without having to worry about protecting someone whose job was to take pictures. The fact that she was prohibited from carrying weapons made her seem like a liability in situations where every person needed to be able to contribute to the team's fighting capability. Sarah understood their perspective even as it frustrated her. She had proven herself physically capable of keeping up with the most demanding operations, and her documentation had contributed to mission success on numerous occasions. But military culture placed a premium on the ability to engage in combat, and her role as an observer rather than a participant automatically relegated her to second-class status in the eyes of many soldiers. The teasing and casual dismissal had become part of her daily routine at Camp Riverside. Soldiers would make jokes about her vacation photos, or suggest that she should stick to taking pictures at family reunions instead of following them into combat zones. Most of the comments were intended as harmless ribbing rather than genuine malice, but they served as constant reminders that she was viewed as an outsider in a community that prized brotherhood and shared sacrifice above all else. Captain James Harrison entered the briefing room with the purposeful stride of an officer who had spent 15 years leading soldiers through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. His presence immediately quieted the casual conversation and jokes as the assembled soldiers shifted their attention to the mission briefing that would determine their activities for the next 5 days. Sarah positioned her camera to document the briefing, as was standard protocol for all major operations. "Listen up," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than rank alone. "We've got intelligence indicating increased insurgent activity along the Pakistan border, specifically in the mountain passes east of our position. Command wants detailed documentation of supply routes, personnel movements, and defensive positions that could threaten our forward operating bases." Sarah began recording as Harrison spread topographical maps across the briefing table, her camera capturing both the visual information and the audio discussion that would be analyzed by intelligence specialists back at headquarters. This was Exactly the kind of mission her documentation skills were designed to support. Extended reconnaissance in dangerous territory, where detailed intelligence could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. This is a 5-day operation, Harrison continued, pointing to marked positions on the map. We'll establish observation posts at these 3 locations, with teams rotating every 48 hours to maintain continuous surveillance. Weather. Reports indicate a winter storm system moving in from the west, so we need to be prepared for extreme conditions and possible delays in extraction. Sergeant Maria Santos, the team's senior non-commissioned officer, leaned forward to study the proposed routes. Sir, what's the enemy strength assessment for this area? These mountain passes have been used for smuggling operations for decades, and the local militants know the terrain better than we do. Harrison nodded grimly. Intelligence estimates suggest we're dealing with a well-trained group with possible military experience. They've established defensive positions that indicate tactical sophistication beyond typical insurgent capabilities. That's why we need detailed documentation of their setup and movement patterns. Sarah focused her camera on the aerial photographs that Harrison was displaying, capturing the terrain features and marked positions that would guide their mission. Planning. The mountain region looked forbidding even from the air, with steep slopes, narrow passes, and countless hiding places where small groups of defenders could hold off much larger attacking forces. It was exactly the kind of environment where superior knowledge of the terrain could overcome advantages in numbers and equipment. Rodriguez, Harrison called, addressing the team's designated marksman. You'll be responsible for overwatch security. During documentation activities, Martinez will handle communications, and Santos will coordinate movement between observation posts. Mitchell will maintain continuous documentation of all enemy activity and terrain features. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez nodded his acknowledgement, his quiet professionalism a stark contrast to the earlier jokes and casual atmosphere. Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran who had earned his position through demonstrated competence in some of the most challenging combat environments on Earth. His reputation for accuracy and calm decision-making under pressure had made him the go-to choice for missions requiring precision shooting and tactical patience. Sarah had worked with Rodriguez on several previous operations, and she respected his professional approach to mission planning and execution. Unlike some of the younger soldiers who questioned her presence on combat missions, Rodriguez judged people based on their performance rather than their job descriptions. He had seen her work under pressure and knew that she could be counted on to do her job effectively, even in dangerous situations. Questions? Harrison asked, scanning the faces of his assembled team. Private Nash raised his hand tentatively. Sir, are we expecting direct engagement with enemy forces, or is this strictly a reconnaissance mission? This is reconnaissance only, Harrison replied firmly. Our job is to gather intelligence, not to start fights. If we do our job correctly, the enemy will never know we were there. But everyone needs to be prepared for the possibility that things could go sideways in a hurry. The terrain works both ways. It provides us with cover and concealment, but it also limits our options for movement and extraction. Sarah made notes about the mission parameters while her camera continued recording. The emphasis on stealth and observation played to her strengths as a documentation specialist, but the remote location and challenging weather conditions would test everyone's abilities to adapt and survive. Mountain warfare was notoriously unpredictable, with conditions that could change from manageable to life-threatening in a matter of hours. After the briefing concluded, Sarah spent the afternoon conducting final equipment checks and preparing for the extreme conditions they would face in the high country. Her camera systems needed to function reliably in sub-freezing temperatures, and her personal gear required careful selection to balance warmth and mobility requirements. She had learned through experience that successful mountain operations depended as much on proper preparation as on tactical skill. The advanced camera equipment that Sarah carried represented the cutting edge of military documentation technology. Her primary system could capture high-definition video and still images at distances exceeding 2 miles, with stabilization systems that compensated for wind and operator movement. Secondary cameras provided backup capability and different lens options for close-range documentation. All of her equipment was ruggedized for military use and capable of operating in extreme temperatures and weather conditions. But it was her personal equipment that revealed the internal conflicts Sarah carried with her on every mission. Tucked into a side pocket of her gear bag was a small leather-bound notebook that had belonged to her father during his service in Vietnam. Bobby Mitchell had used the notebook to record range cards, wind measurements, and shooting solutions during his time as a Ranger sniper. The pages were filled with his precise handwriting documenting the technical details of precision shooting under combat conditions. Sarah had found the notebook while helping her parents organize Tyler's medical paperwork after his injury. Her father had never mentioned keeping detailed shooting records during his military service, and discovering the notebook had provided insight into the professional precision that had made him one of the most effective snipers in his unit. The mathematical calculations and environmental observations revealed a level of scientific rigor that went far beyond the casual marksmanship training he had provided on the ranch. Reading through her father's notes had awakened something in Sarah that she had tried to suppress since enlisting as a documentation specialist. The technical aspects of precision shooting fascinated her in the same way that photography did, requiring the same attention to detail, understanding of light and shadow, and ability to predict and compensate for environmental factors. The skills were so closely related that mastering one naturally led to proficiency in the other. But carrying her father's notebook also served as a reminder of the promise she had made to Tyler and her mother. The Mitchell family had already sacrificed enough to military service, and Sarah's role as a documentation specialist represented a compromise that allowed her to serve while minimizing the risk of the kind of injury that had shattered Tyler's dreams and their mother's peace of mind. As evening approached at Camp Riverside, Sarah walked to the base communications center to place her weekly call home to Montana. The time difference meant that her parents would be finishing dinner at the ranch, probably sitting on the front porch watching the sun set behind the Bertooth Mountains. It was a ritual that had connected her to home throughout her military service, providing a reminder of the life and family that waited for her return. Linda Mitchell answered the phone on the second ring, her voice carrying the warmth and concern that had sustained Sarah through the most challenging aspects of military life. "How are you doing, sweetheart? You sound tired." "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah replied, settling into the privacy booth that allowed soldiers to make personal calls without being overheard. "We're heading out on another documentation mission tomorrow. Nothing too dangerous, just reconnaissance work in the mountains." Her mother's pause spoke volumes about the worry that Sarah's military service caused her. "Promise me you'll be careful out there. I know you think your job is safe, but I watch the news. I know what's happening in Afghanistan." Sarah closed her eyes and felt the familiar weight of her promise to keep herself out of harm's way. "I promise, Mom, I'm not a combat soldier. My job is to take pictures and stay out of trouble. The other soldiers are there to handle the dangerous stuff." "Your father wants to talk to you," Linda said, and Sarah heard the phone being passed across the kitchen table, where her parents shared their evening meals. Bobby Mitchell's voice carried the steady confidence that had guided Sarah through childhood and shaped her understanding of responsibility and duty. "How's the team treating you, kiddo?" "They're good soldiers, Dad. Some of them still think I'm just along for the ride, but the ones who matter know I can do my job." Sarah hesitated before continuing. "I wish Tyler could see some of the work I'm doing. I think he'd be proud." "He is proud," her father replied without hesitation. "We all are. You found a way to serve that honors our family tradition while being smart about the risks." That takes more courage than most people realize." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, covering ranch business, Tyler's progress in his civilian job training, and family news from Billings. But it was her father's final words that stayed with Sarah as she prepared for the mission ahead. "Remember what I taught you about making decisions under pressure," Bobby said quietly. "Trust your training, trust your instincts, and don't second-guess yourself when it matters. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right choice, even when it doesn't feel that way at the time." Sarah hung up the phone wondering if her father somehow knew about the internal struggle she faced every time she deployed with combat units. His words seemed to carry a deeper meaning than simple encouragement, as if he understood that she might someday face a situation where her carefully constructed boundaries between documentation and participation would be tested in ways she couldn't anticipate. That night, as Sarah conducted final preparations for the mission, she found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. 3 years of carrying cameras instead of rifles had established her identity as a documentation specialist, but they had also created an internal tension that grew stronger with each dangerous mission. She was highly trained, physically capable, and naturally skilled at the very combat abilities that her role prohibited her from using. The contradiction felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that she had the ability to fly but lacking the courage to spread her wings. Every mission brought situations where her shooting skills could have made a difference, but her promise to her family and her official role as a non-combatant kept her on the sidelines of the very conflicts she was risking her life to document. As Sarah packed her father's notebook alongside her camera equipment, she wondered if tomorrow's mission might finally force her to confront the choice between who she had promised to be and who she was capable of becoming. The mountains of Afghanistan had a way of stripping away pretense and revealing the truth about people under pressure. In less than 12 hours, she would find out which version of herself would emerge when everything she cared about was on the line. The transport convoy departed Camp Riverside at 0430 hours, a procession of armored vehicles cutting through the pre-dawn darkness as they wound their way toward the treacherous mountain passes that marked the Afghan-Pakistani border. Sarah sat in the rear compartment of the third vehicle, her documentation equipment secured in foam-lined cases around her feet, listening to the rhythmic hum of the diesel engine and the occasional crackle of radio communications between the drivers. The regulations governing her role as a visual documentation specialist were crystal clear and had been drilled into her consciousness through months of training and operational experience. She was authorized to carry camera equipment, communication devices, and personal protection gear, but under no circumstances was she permitted to bear arms during combat operations. Her identification tags clearly marked her as non-combatant personnel, a designation that theoretically provided certain protections under international law, but also served as a constant reminder of her limitations in tactical situations. Military doctrine treated documentation specialists as valuable but fragile assets, personnel whose primary contribution lay in their technical expertise rather than their ability to engage enemy forces. The entire structure of her role was built around the assumption that others would provide security while she focused on capturing intelligence-grade footage. It was a system that worked well in controlled environments, but Sarah had learned through bitter experience that combat rarely unfolded according to neat theoretical frameworks. Private Danny Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his seat across from Sarah, his nervous energy manifesting in the kind of restless fidgeting that marked soldiers on their first deployment. At 19 years old, Walsh represented the eager inexperience that characterized many new arrivals to Afghanistan, young men who had enlisted with romantic notions about military service that rarely survived contact with the harsh realities of mountain warfare. "So Mitchell," Walsh said, his voice carrying forced casualness, "what exactly do you do when the shooting starts? I mean, if we get hit, do you just keep filming while everyone else fights back?" His question wasn't malicious, but it reflected The fundamental disconnect between combat soldiers and support personnel that had defined Sarah's entire military experience. Sarah looked up from her equipment checklist, meeting Walsh's curious gaze with the patient expression she had developed. For explaining her role to newcomers. My job is to document everything that happens, regardless of the tactical situation. If we make contact with enemy forces, I keep recording until ordered to stop or until the equipment is damaged beyond use. The footage I capture during combat operations often provides crucial intelligence about enemy tactics and capabilities. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been quietly reviewing topographical maps in the front of the compartment, glanced up from his paperwork. "Walsh, you'll understand soon enough. Mitchell's footage has been used to train soldiers at bases all over Afghanistan. Her work during the Helmand operation last year identified enemy sniper positions that our intelligence analysts had missed. Completely. Sometimes the camera sees things that eyes in the moment can't catch." The validation from Rodriguez meant more to Sarah than she cared to admit. As the team's senior marksman, his opinion carried significant weight with the younger soldiers, and his public support helped counteract some of the skepticism that surrounded her presence on combat missions. But even Rodriguez's endorsement couldn't change the fundamental reality of her situation. When violence erupted, she would remain an observer while others risked their lives to protect her. The convoy climbed steadily through increasingly rugged terrain, navigating switchback roads that had been carved into mountainsides by Soviet engineers decades earlier. The asphalt had long since cracked and deteriorated under the assault of weather and neglect, leaving behind surfaces that challenged even the most capable military vehicles. Sarah watched through reinforced windows as the landscape transformed from rolling foothills to dramatic peaks that scraped against low-hanging clouds. Corporal Alex Chun, the team's communications specialist, monitored radio traffic from his position near the vehicle's radio equipment. Chun was a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, whose technical expertise with electronic systems had made him invaluable for operations in the communication-challenging environment of mountainous Afghanistan. His ability to maintain contact with headquarters, despite terrain obstacles and enemy jamming efforts, had saved lives on numerous occasions. "Command is reporting increased electronic activity in our target area," Chun announced, his voice cutting through the engine noise. "Looks like someone's using sophisticated communication equipment, possibly including frequency-hopping radios that suggest military-grade hardware." He paused to adjust his headset before continuing. "They want us to be especially careful about our own communication security. If these guys have the kind of equipment Command thinks they do, they might be able to monitor our transmissions." The implications of Chun's report settled over the vehicle like a cold mountain fog. Insurgent groups with access to military-grade communication equipment represented a significant escalation in threat level, suggesting either state sponsorship or successful raids on government forces. Such groups typically possessed training and capabilities that far exceeded those of typical militant organizations, making them exponentially more dangerous for small reconnaissance teams operating without immediate backup support. Sarah began mentally adjusting her documentation priorities based on this new intelligence. If they were indeed facing professional military opponents, her footage would need to capture not only their positions and movements, but also detailed information about their equipment, communications procedures, and tactical capabilities. The intelligence value of such documentation could be enormous, but obtaining it would require positioning herself closer to enemy forces than standard safety protocols recommended. The weight of her role's limitations pressed against Sarah's consciousness like a physical burden. Her training and instincts told her that effective intelligence gathering in this environment would require the flexibility to adapt quickly to changing tactical situations. But her official designation as a non-combatant meant that she was entirely dependent on others for protection, a dependency that could compromise mission effectiveness if circumstances forced the team to choose between completing their documentation objectives and ensuring her safety. Sergeant Maria Santos, who had been conducting final equipment checks in the vehicle's forward compartment, moved back to brief the team on immediate operational procedures. Santos was a 12-year veteran whose reputation for tactical competence and leadership under pressure had earned her the respect of soldiers throughout the division. Her presence on the mission provided a level of experienced oversight that helped offset some of the risks inherent in operating small teams in hostile territory. We'll establish our first observation post approximately 2 kilometers from the suspected enemy position, Santos explained, spreading a laminated map across her lap. Mitchell, you'll set up your primary documentation equipment here. She pointed to a marked position with clear lines of sight to the target valley. Rodriguez will provide overwatch security from this elevated position, and the rest of the team will maintain perimeter security and communication links. Sarah studied the proposed positions, noting the distances and sight lines that would determine her ability to capture useful footage. The observation post offered excellent visibility of the target area, but it also placed her team within range of enemy weapons if their presence was detected. It was the kind of tactical compromise that characterized mountain warfare, where the terrain that provided concealment and observation opportunities also created vulnerability to counterattack. What's our extraction plan if things go sideways? Private Nash asked, his voice betraying the nervousness that had been building since the mission briefing. Nash was on his second deployment, but had not yet experienced the kind of sustained contact with professional enemy forces that this mission might entail. Santos traced alternative routes on the map with her finger, highlighting escape paths that took advantage of natural terrain features. We've got 3 primary exfiltration routes, each leading to different pickup zones, where helicopters can extract us under varying weather conditions. But our best protection is maintaining operational security and avoiding detection in the first place. The conversation highlighted one of the fundamental challenges of Sarah's role in combat operations. While the soldiers around her could contribute to their own protection through direct action, her effectiveness depended entirely on remaining stationary and exposed for extended periods while operating camera equipment. If the team was forced to move quickly under enemy fire, her documentation mission would be compromised. But if they prioritized her equipment needs over tactical mobility, everyone's safety could be endangered. As the convoy continued its climb toward the operational area, Sarah found herself thinking about the careful balance she had constructed between serving her country and honoring her promise to her family. The role of visual documentation specialist had seemed like the perfect solution when she enlisted, allowing her to contribute meaningfully to military operations without directly participating in combat. But 3 years of deployments had gradually revealed the limitations and contradictions inherent in trying to document warfare while remaining separate from it. The technical demands of her job required her to position herself in locations where combat was most likely to occur, using equipment that was valuable enough to attract enemy attention and bulky enough to limit her mobility. She was trained to maintain her composure under fire, but not trained to return fire if attacked. She was expected to capture footage of tactical situations, but not expected to provide tactical input based on what she observed. It was a role that placed her at the intersection of action and observation without allowing her to fully embrace either position. Captain Harrison's voice crackled through the vehicle's communication system, announcing their approach to the dismount point where they would leave the vehicles and continue on foot toward their observation positions. The final phase of their journey would take them through terrain that was impassable for vehicles, requiring them to carry all their equipment across several kilometers of rocky mountain trails that offered numerous opportunities for ambush. Sarah began the familiar ritual of preparing her equipment for foot movement, distributing camera systems and support gear across multiple packs to ensure that critical capabilities would survive if individual pieces of equipment were lost or damaged. Her loadout included primary and backup camera systems, extended life batteries rated for extreme cold weather, satellite communication equipment for transmitting footage back to headquarters, and enough personal gear to survive for 5 days in harsh mountain conditions. The total weight of her equipment exceeded 40 pounds, not including personal protective gear and survival supplies. While Sarah's ranch background and military training had prepared her physically for such loads, carrying technical equipment through combat zones required a different kind of endurance than the cardiovascular fitness needed for traditional infantry operations. Her equipment was fragile enough to require careful handling, but the mission timeline demanded movement speeds that left little room for the cautious approach that electronic systems typically required. Private Walsh watched Sarah's equipment preparation with the fascination of someone encountering military technology for the first time. "That camera setup must be worth more than my car," he observed, noting the ruggedized cases and specialized mounts that protected the advanced optics from shock and weather damage. "The primary lens alone costs about $60,000, Sarah replied, checking the seals on a weather protective housing. "But it can capture clear images of human-sized targets at distances exceeding 3 miles, even in low-light conditions. That capability can mean the difference between mission success and failure when we're trying to identify enemy personnel and equipment from concealed positions." Rodriguez looked up from his own equipment preparations, his expression thoughtful. "Mitchell, what's the maximum effective range of your documentation equipment in these weather conditions? I need to know how far out I can position myself for overwatch while still maintaining visual contact with your operation." The question reflected the kind of professional collaboration that Sarah valued most about working with experienced soldiers like Rodriguez. Rather than questioning her presence on the mission, he was focused on integrating her capabilities into the overall tactical plan in ways that maximized effectiveness while minimizing risk for everyone involved. "In current visibility conditions, I can capture usable footage out to approximately 4,000 meters, Sarah responded, consulting technical specifications from her equipment manual. "But for the kind of detailed intelligence documentation you're looking for, I'll need to be within 2,000 meters of the target area. That puts me well within small arms range if we're detected." The mathematics of mountain warfare were unforgiving in their clarity. The same long sight lines that made Sarah's documentation equipment effective also made her team vulnerable to enemy observation and fire. The elevated positions that provided the best camera angles were often the same positions that enemy snipers would choose for their own operations. It was a tactical puzzle that had no perfect solution, only compromises that balanced competing risks and objectives. Santos studied the terrain features on her map, calculating movement times and defensive positions that would provide the best combination of documentation opportunities and team security. "We'll establish overwatch positions here and here." She indicated 2 elevated locations, with primary documentation from this central position. "If we maintain good noise discipline and camouflage, we should be able to observe enemy activity for the full 48 hours without being detected." The plan sounded reasonable in the controlled environment of the vehicle, but Sarah knew from experience that mountain operations rarely unfolded according to initial plans. Weather conditions could change rapidly, enemy forces might be more alert than expected, and equipment failures could compromise critical capabilities at the worst possible moments. Successful operations required not only good planning, but also the flexibility to adapt when circumstances demanded deviation from original intentions. As the convoy reached the dismount point, Sarah felt the familiar combination of anticipation and anxiety that marked the transition from relative safety to operational exposure. The next phase of their mission would place them beyond the reach of immediate support, dependent entirely on their own skills and equipment for survival and mission accomplishment. It was the moment when theoretical planning gave way to practical implementation, and when the limitations of her role as a non-combatant observer would be tested against the harsh realities of mountain warfare. Part 3. The Hidden Foundation. The dismount location was nothing more than a widening in the mountain road where Soviet engineers had blasted away enough rock to create a small staging area for military vehicles. Sarah shouldered her equipment. Packen followed the team as they moved away from the armored vehicles that had provided protection and mobility for the first phase of their journey. The transition from mounted to dismounted operations always felt like stepping across an invisible threshold, leaving behind the mechanical security of steel and armor for the organic uncertainty of human movement through hostile terrain. The morning air at 8,000 feet elevation carried the bite of approaching winter, with temperatures that would drop below freezing once the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Sarah's breath formed small clouds as she adjusted the straps of her equipment pack, distributing the weight across her shoulders and hips in ways that would minimize fatigue during the long approach march to their observation positions. The technical gear that comprised her primary military value was also her greatest physical burden, a reality that never failed to remind her of the contradictions inherent in her role. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez moved with the fluid efficiency of a soldier who had spent years navigating dangerous terrain in hostile countries. His personal equipment was arranged with the mathematical precision that characterized professional marksmen, every item positioned for instant access while maintaining the low profile necessary for concealed movement. The rifle across his back was a precision instrument capable of engaging targets at distances that exceeded the effective range of most enemy weapons, but its effectiveness depended entirely on his ability to reach advantageous positions without being detected. "Mitchell," Rodriguez called softly as the team began their approach march, "stay close to Chun during movement. If we make contact, your priority is protecting that camera equipment, not participating in the fight. We can replace soldiers, but we can't replace the intelligence you're here to gather." The instruction highlighted the fundamental tension that defined Sarah's existence in combat zones. Her equipment and expertise were considered valuable enough to justify the risks of bringing a non-combatant into dangerous situations. But that same non-combatant status meant she was prohibited from contributing to her own protection in meaningful ways. It was a paradox that placed her simultaneously at the center and the periphery of military operations. Private Walsh struggled with his own equipment load, the weight of ammunition, communications gear, and survival supplies testing, physical conditioning that had been developed in the controlled environment of training bases rather than the oxygen-depleted atmosphere of high-altitude operations. His breathing was already labored after just 20 minutes of uphill movement, and Sarah could see the sweat forming on his forehead despite the cold morning air. The trail they followed had been carved into the mountainside by generations of smugglers, traders, and military forces who had recognized the strategic importance of the high passes that connected Afghanistan with Pakistan. The path was barely wide enough for single-file movement in most places, with drop-offs that plunged hundreds of feet into rocky valleys below. Sarah had learned to focus on the ground immediately in front of her feet, rather than looking down into the abyssal spaces that opened up beside the trail. Sergeant Santos maintained point position, using hand signals to communicate hazards and direction changes to the team members strung out behind her. Santos moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years reading terrain for tactical advantages and threats, her eyes constantly scanning for signs of enemy presence or natural dangers that could compromise their mission. The responsibility for leading small teams through hostile territory had shaped her into the kind of soldier that others instinctively followed, even in circumstances where leadership meant accepting greater personal risk. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah found herself thinking about the shooting skills that lay dormant beneath her official identity as a documentation specialist. The muscle memory remained intact despite years of deliberate disuse, surfacing occasionally during routine training exercises in ways that surprised instructors and drew unwanted attention from superiors, who questioned why someone with her natural abilities had chosen a non-combat role. The contradiction between her capabilities and her chosen limitations had become more pronounced with each deployment, as she witnessed tactical situations where her shooting skills could have made meaningful differences in outcomes. But those moments of internal conflict were balanced by the knowledge that her family was sleeping peacefully in Montana, secure in the belief that their daughter and sister was serving her country without exposing herself to the kind of violence that had shattered Tyler's dreams and their mother's peace of mind. The ranch where Sarah had learned to shoot was a world away from the barren peaks that surrounded her team as they moved toward their observation positions. The grasslands of Montana offered clean sightlines and predictable wind patterns that made precision shooting a matter of mathematics and muscle memory. But the mountains of Afghanistan presented challenges that no amount of range time could fully prepare someone to address: rapidly changing weather conditions, complex wind patterns created by competing thermal currents, and the psychological pressure of knowing that missed shots could result in the death of teammates rather than simply lower scores on paper targets. Bobby Mitchell had understood the difference between recreational shooting and combat marksmanship in ways that he had tried to communicate to his daughter, without explicitly acknowledging the military applications of the skills he was teaching. His instruction had emphasized the mental discipline required for precision shooting under pressure, the importance of environmental awareness, and the absolute necessity of accepting responsibility for every round fired. Those lessons had shaped Sarah's approach to photography as much as her approach to shooting, teaching her to see patterns and anticipate moments of significance before they occurred. The leather notebook that Sarah carried in her equipment pack contained her father's precise documentation of shooting solutions for various ranges and conditions, mathematical formulas that translated environmental factors into scope adjustments, with the kind of scientific rigor that characterized professional snipers. Reading through his notes during quiet moments on previous deployments had provided insight into the intellectual complexity that lay beneath the popular perception of sniping as simply enhanced marksmanship. Corporal Chun paused to check his RADIO equipment, ensuring that their communication links with headquarters remained functional despite the challenging terrain and potential enemy jamming efforts. The frequencies they used for tactical communications were constantly monitored by intelligence services on both sides of the conflict, creating an ongoing chess game of electronic warfare that most soldiers never fully appreciated. Chun's expertise in communication security was one of the invisible factors that could determine mission success or failure, but his contributions rarely received the recognition accorded to more dramatic military specialties. "Command is requesting an initial position report," Chun announced quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the rock formations around them. "They want confirmation that we're on schedule and haven't encountered any unexpected obstacles." Santos consulted her GPS unit and map before responding, calculating their progress against the timeline that had been established during mission planning. "Tell them we're 15 minutes behind schedule due to terrain conditions, but still within acceptable parameters for reaching the observation post before dark. No enemy contact, no equipment failures, no personnel issues." The routine nature of the communication belied the significance of their journey. Every mile they traveled took them further from friendly forces and closer to enemy positions that had been carefully prepared by opponents who knew the terrain intimately. The mountains that provided concealment for their approach also offered countless opportunities for ambush, creating a tactical environment where advantage could shift rapidly between opposing forces. Sarah's camera equipment allowed her to document the stunning natural beauty of the Afghan mountains, even as she remained focused on their military mission. The peaks around them rose to elevations exceeding 15,000 feet, their snow-covered summits catching the morning light in ways that created dramatic contrasts between shadow and illumination. It was the kind of landscape that inspired artists and photographers, but also the kind of terrain that had defeated military forces throughout history. The physical demands of high-altitude movement gradually revealed the differences in conditioning and experience among team members. Rodriguez and Santos moved with the steady efficiency of veterans who had learned to pace themselves for extended operations in difficult conditions. Chun maintained good progress despite the technical gear that complicated his load distribution. Walsh struggled but persevered, his determination to keep up with more experienced soldiers driving him forward even as the altitude and weight began to take their toll. Sarah found herself drawing on conditioning that combined her ranch background with military training designed specifically for mountain operations. The cardiovascular demands of high-altitude movement were familiar from childhood summers spent working cattle in the high pastures of the Bertooth Mountains, but the psychological pressure of moving through hostile territory added a dimension of stress that no amount of physical preparation could entirely address. As they approached a particularly exposed section of trail, Santos called a halt to assess the tactical situation before committing the team to movement across open ground. The valley below offered excellent fields of fire for enemy observers, while the trail itself provided no cover or concealment for several hundred meters. It was the kind of terrain feature that demanded careful timing and coordination to cross safely. "Mitchell," Santos whispered, gesturing for Sarah to move forward to her position, "I want you to glass that ridgeline across the valley before we move. Your optics are better than anything else we're carrying, and I need to know if there's anyone watching this trail." Sarah unpacked her primary camera system and attached the longest telephoto lens in her kit, creating a combination that provided magnification capabilities exceeding those of standard military binoculars. Through the viewfinder, the distant ridgeline came into sharp focus, revealing details that were invisible to the naked eye at such ranges. She methodically scanned the terrain features where an observer might position himself, looking for the subtle signs that could indicate human presence among natural rock formations. The systematic visual search was identical to the process that snipers used for identifying targets and threats at extended ranges. Sarah's photographic training had taught her to recognize patterns and anomalies in visual information, skills that translated directly to tactical observation tasks. Her ability to spot details that others missed had contributed to mission success on multiple previous operations, but always in the role of observer rather than decision-maker. "I'm not seeing any obvious signs of observation posts," Sarah reported, after completing her scan, "but there are several positions that would provide excellent overwatch of this trail. If someone's there, they're well concealed and maintaining good noise discipline." Santos nodded grimly, understanding that the absence of obvious threats didn't guarantee safety in terrain that favored defenders. "We'll move across in pairs, with 60-second intervals between movements. Rodriguez, you'll provide overwatch from here until everyone else is across, then follow as the last man." The crossing proceeded without incident, but the tension of moving through exposed terrain reminded everyone that they were operating in an environment where enemy forces could engage them at ranges and times of their choosing. The tactical initiative belonged to whoever controlled the high ground, and their mission required them to establish positions in areas where that control was contested by professional opponents with intimate knowledge of local terrain. Once the team had successfully crossed the exposed section, they resumed their approach toward the observation post that would serve as their base of operations for the next 48 hours. The final phase of movement took them through increasingly difficult terrain, requiring them to navigate rockfalls and steep slopes that tested both physical conditioning and equipment durability. Sarah's camera gear survived the challenging movement without damage, but the constant need to protect sensitive electronic equipment while maintaining operational pace highlighted the fundamental challenges of her role. Combat operations demanded speed and flexibility that often conflicted with the careful handling that technical equipment required. The balance between equipment protection and mission effectiveness was a constant source of tension that could only be resolved through experience and intuitive understanding of when risks were justified. As they approached their destination, the team began the transition from movement to establishment of defensive positions. The observation post needed to provide concealment from enemy observation while offering clear sight lines to the target area. It also needed to be defensible in case their presence was detected and accessible to helicopter extraction if weather conditions permitted. The site that Santos selected met most of their requirements, offering natural camouflage among large rock formations while providing multiple escape routes if the position was compromised. Sarah began setting up her primary documentation equipment, using natural terrain features to conceal the distinctive shapes of camera lenses that could reveal their position to enemy observers. The process of establishing an effective observation post required balancing competing priorities that reflected the different roles and responsibilities of team members. Sarah needed clear sight lines and stable platforms for her camera equipment. Rodriguez required positions that offered long-range shooting opportunities while maintaining concealment. Chun needed locations where his communication equipment could function effectively despite terrain obstacles. Santos coordinated these requirements into an overall defensive plan that provided security for the team while supporting their intelligence-gathering mission. Her experience in mountain operations enabled her to anticipate problems and develop solutions before they compromised mission effectiveness. The skill required to lead small teams in hostile environments was one of the most demanding challenges. In military service requiring technical competence, tactical understanding, and leadership abilities that could function under extreme stress. As the sun reached its zenith above the Afghan peaks, Sarah completed the setup of her documentation equipment and began the patient process of observing the target area for signs of enemy activity. The next phase of their mission would test not only her technical skills, but also her ability to maintain focus and alertness during extended periods of inactivity, punctuated by moments of intense significance. The weight of her hidden capabilities pressed against her consciousness as she settled into position behind her camera. Somewhere in the valleys below, enemy forces were conducting operations that threatened American and Allied personnel throughout the region. Her job was to document their activities, but her training and instincts whispered suggestions about more direct forms of intervention that her official role prohibited. For now, Sarah Mitchell remained the camera girl, focused on capturing intelligence that others would use to make tactical decisions. But the mountains of Afghanistan had a way of testing the limits of identity and forcing people to confront the difference between who they thought they were and who they needed to become when everything they cared about was on the line. Part 4. The defining wound, the memory hit. Sarah with crystalline clarity as she adjusted her camera's focus on the valley below. The mechanical precision of her movements triggering recollections that she had spent 3 years trying to suppress. It was Tyler's voice that came to her first, echoing across the years from a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and shattered dreams, his words carrying the weight of a future that would never unfold as planned. Tyler Mitchell had been everything their father had hoped for in a son who would carry on the family's military tradition. 6 feet 2 inches of rangy Montana muscle, with the kind of easy confidence that made people instinctively trust his judgment and follow his lead. He had excelled at everything he attempted, from high school football to rodeo competition to the marksmanship skills that seemed to run in the Mitchell bloodline like an inherited gift passed down through generations of soldiers and ranchers. The decision to enlist had been Tyler's alone, made during his senior year of high school when military recruiters painted pictures of adventure and purpose that seemed to offer everything a young man from rural Montana could want. Bobby Mitchell had been quietly proud of his son's choice, understanding that military service would provide opportunities and experiences that ranch life could never match. Linda Mitchell had worried, as mothers always do, but she had also recognized that trying to prevent Tyler from following his dreams would only damage their relationship without changing his fundamental nature. Sarah had been a sophomore at Montana State University when Tyler completed basic training, studying photography, and dreaming of a career that would take her to remote locations around the world to document wildlife and natural landscapes. She admired her brother's courage in choosing military service, but her own interests lay in capturing the beauty of creation rather than the violence of human conflict. The idea that she might someday wear a uniform herself had never seriously crossed her mind. Tyler's first deployment to Iraq had been a successful introduction to combat operations, earning him commendations for his performance during convoy escort missions and forward operating base security duties. His letters home had been filled with descriptions of the tactical challenges and professional satisfaction that came from working with elite military units. The photographs he sent showed a young man who had found his calling, surrounded by teammates who shared his commitment to mission accomplishment and mutual protection. The transition to Afghanistan for Tyler's second deployment had represented a promotion in responsibility and trust, with assignment to a special operations unit that conducted high-risk missions in contested territory. His role as a vehicle commander placed him at the center of operations that required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure, exactly the kind of challenge that had always brought out his best qualities. For the first 6 months of the deployment, everything had proceeded according to plan. Sarah had been in her campus darkroom, developing photographs from a wildlife expedition in Yellowstone National Park, when the phone call came that changed everything. The voice belonged to a casualty notification officer from Walter Reed Medical Center, a professional who had made countless similar calls to families whose lives were about to be shattered by news from distant battlefields. The words were carefully chosen to convey essential information while minimizing trauma, but no amount of training could soften the fundamental reality of what had happened. The improvised explosive device had been sophisticated beyond anything Tyler's unit had previously encountered, containing components that suggested construction by someone with formal military training in demolitions and booby trap employment. Intelligence analysts would later determine that the device represented a new level of technical sophistication among insurgent bomb makers, incorporating design features that made detection extremely difficult, even with advanced equipment. Tyler's vehicle had been third in a convoy of 4 armored trucks, conducting a routine supply run between forward operating bases, a mission that had been completed successfully dozens of times without significant incident. The road they traveled was considered relatively secure, patrolled regularly by friendly forces and monitored by aerial surveillance assets that should have detected any suspicious activity. But the enemy had demonstrated patience and tactical sophistication that exceeded American intelligence estimates. The explosion had been timed to catch Tyler's vehicle at the precise moment when it was most vulnerable, positioned on a narrow section of road where evasive maneuvers were impossible and escape routes were limited. The force of the blast had been sufficient to flip the 7-ton armored truck completely over, crushing the roof and trapping the occupants inside a twisted mass of steel and burning fuel. 3 soldiers had died instantly, their bodies too damaged for identification except through dental records and DNA analysis. Tyler had survived because he had been thrown clear of the vehicle during the initial explosion. His body launched 30 feet through the air before impacting against a rocky embankment that broke his ribs, but saved him from the secondary explosions that consumed the wreckage. The traumatic amputation of his right arm had occurred when debris from the destroyed vehicle struck him during his flight, severing the limb cleanly just below the shoulder in a wound that probably saved his life by preventing him from bleeding to death before medical help arrived. The rescue and medical evacuation had been a masterpiece of military efficiency, with helicopter crews risking their own lives to extract casualties from an area that remained under sporadic enemy fire. Combat medics had performed emergency surgery. In the back of a helicopter flying at maximum speed toward the trauma center at Bagram Air Base, their skills and determination preventing additional deaths among the wounded survivors of the attack. Sarah's flight from Montana to Washington, D.C. had been a journey through a landscape of disbelief and denial, her mind struggling to process the reality that her invincible older brother was lying in a hospital bed with injuries that would forever change his life and dreams. The family's arrival at Walter Reed had coincided with Tyler's emergence from the medically induced coma that doctors had used to manage his pain during the initial treatment phase. The young man they found in that hospital room bore little resemblance to the confident soldier who had deployed to Afghanistan 6 months earlier. Tyler's physical wounds were obvious and devastating, but the psychological damage was even more profound. The brother who had always been the family's source of strength and optimism had been replaced by someone who struggled to find meaning or purpose in a future that no longer included the military career that had defined his identity. Bobby Mitchell had remained stoic during those first difficult days, channeling his grief into practical activities like communicating with doctors, coordinating with military liaisons, and managing the logistics of extended hospitalization. But Sarah had seen her father's tears during quiet moments when he thought no one was watching, understanding that Tyler's injuries represented the destruction of dreams that extended far beyond one young man's military service. Linda Mitchell's reaction had been more obvious and immediate, her maternal instincts transforming grief into a fierce protectiveness that manifested as barely controlled anger at the military system that had allowed her son to be damaged so severely. She demanded explanations that no one could provide, solutions that didn't exist, and guarantees that the sacrifice would somehow prove worthwhile. Her pain was so intense that it seemed to fill the hospital room like a toxic presence that poisoned every conversation and interaction. It was during the 3rd week of Tyler's hospitalization that Sarah made the promise that would define the rest of her military career. She was sitting beside her brother's bed during one of his lucid periods, watching him struggle with the simple task of eating dinner with his remaining hand. The frustration and humiliation that Tyler felt was written across his face in expressions that broke Sarah's heart and filled her with determination to somehow make amends for his sacrifice. "I'm never going to be the soldier Dad wanted me to be," Tyler said quietly, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had accepted a reality too painful to fully acknowledge. "I'm never going to carry on the family tradition. I'm never going to make a difference." Sarah took her brother's hand and made a commitment that surprised even herself with its intensity and certainty. "I'll serve," she said firmly. "I'll find a way to honor what you were trying to do. But I'll do it in a way that won't destroy Mom any more than she's already been destroyed." Tyler's eyes had filled with tears as he squeezed her hand with what strength remained in his injured body. "You don't have to sacrifice your dreams for my mistakes," he whispered. "You don't have to become something you're not just to make up for what happened to me." But Sarah's decision had already crystallized with the clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of profound emotional intensity. She would find a way to serve her country and honor her family's military tradition while minimizing the risk of physical injury that could shatter her parents' hearts as completely as Tyler's injuries had done. It seemed like the perfect solution to an impossible situation, a compromise that would allow her to serve while providing her family with the security of knowing she was relatively safe. The months that followed Tyler's medical discharge had been a blur of rehabilitation appointments, adaptive equipment training, and difficult conversations about the future. Tyler's physical recovery progressed steadily, but his psychological adjustment to civilian life proved much more challenging. The young man who had found purpose and identity in military service struggled to discover meaning in a world that seemed to offer only consolation prizes for dreams that could never be fulfilled. Sarah's decision to enlist as a visual documentation Specialist had provided Tyler with something to focus on besides his own losses, a way to maintain connection to military service through his sister's experiences. He had thrown himself into researching her career field, understanding her equipment, and following her training progress with the intensity that he had once devoted to his own military preparation. In some ways, Sarah's service became a vicarious continuation of Tyler's interrupted career, allowing him to remain connected to the military community that had been such an important part of his identity. The irony of Sarah's situation was not lost on anyone in the Mitchell family. She possessed natural shooting abilities that exceeded Tyler's considerable skills, but she had chosen a military role that prohibited her from using those capabilities in ways that could directly contribute to mission success. It was as if she had deliberately selected the one military occupation that would waste her greatest talents while providing the illusion of meaningful service. Bobby Mitchell understood his daughter's reasoning and supported her decision, but he also recognized the internal conflict that her choice created. During quiet conversations on the ranch, he had tried to help Sarah understand that serving according to her capabilities rather than her fears might ultimately prove more honorable than choosing safety over effectiveness. But he had also respected her autonomy and her commitment to protecting the family from additional heartbreak. The radio crackled to life with an urgency that cut through the mountain silence like a blade, Captain Harrison's voice carrying the kind of controlled tension that experienced soldiers recognized as the precursor to significant tactical developments. Sarah looked up from her camera equipment, her hands automatically pausing in their methodical adjustment of focus and exposure settings, as she processed the implications of what she was hearing through her earpiece. "All stations, this is Phoenix Actual," Harrison's transmission began, using the call sign that identified him as the mission commander to anyone monitoring their communications. "Intelligence update from higher. We have confirmed enemy activity in sectors 7 through 12, with estimated strength significantly higher than initial briefing indicated. Repeat, enemy strength assessment has been revised upward." The words hung in the thin mountain air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with them the promise of complications that could transform their reconnaissance mission from routine intelligence gathering into something far more dangerous. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she absorbed the tactical implications of Harrison's update, understanding that increased enemy presence would require fundamental changes to their operational approach and risk assessment procedures. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez shifted position behind his spotting scope, his movements economical and precise as he adjusted his observation angle to cover additional terrain features that might conceal hostile forces. The professional calm that characterized his demeanor remained intact, but Sarah could see the subtle changes in his posture and scanning patterns that indicated heightened alertness. Rodriguez had survived multiple deployments by treating every piece of tactical intelligence as potentially life-threatening, regardless of how routine the mission had initially appeared. "Phoenix Actual, this is Overwatch," Rodriguez responded, his voice maintaining the flat professionalism that marked experienced marksman operating under pressure. "Request clarification on revised enemy strength estimates and any changes to our operational parameters. Current position provides good observation of assigned sectors, but expanded target area may require repositioning primary assets." Sarah understood that Rodriguez's carefully neutral language concealed significant concerns about their ability to accomplish the mission safely with their current team size and equipment load. Intelligence gathering operations were designed around specific assumptions about enemy capabilities and intentions, and substantial changes to those assumptions could invalidate entire tactical approaches. The professional questions that Rodriguez was asking reflected years of experience with missions that had gone sideways when intelligence estimates proved inadequate. Corporal Chen was already working to establish clearer communication links with headquarters, his fingers moving across radio controls with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that reliable information flow could determine mission success or failure. The mountainous terrain that provided concealment for their observation post also created significant challenges for radio communications, requiring constant adjustments to maintain contact with command elements that might need to provide immediate tactical support. Higher reports intercepted communications suggesting coordinated movement of personnel and equipment into our operational area. Harrison continued, his transmission providing details that painted an increasingly complex picture of the tactical situation. Enemy forces appear to be establishing defensive positions consistent with advanced knowledge of coalition reconnaissance activities in this sector. The implications of Harrison's words settled over the team like a cold mountain fog, bringing with them the uncomfortable possibility that their mission had been compromised before it began. Sarah's documentation training had included extensive instruction on operational security procedures, emphasizing the sophisticated intelligence capabilities that insurgent groups had developed through years of conflict with coalition forces. The prospect that enemy forces might have anticipated their reconnaissance mission suggested either serious security breaches or intelligence capabilities that exceeded previous assessments. Private Walsh fidgeted with his equipment, the nervous energy that had characterized his behavior throughout the approach march, now manifesting as barely controlled anxiety about their tactical situation. At 19 years old, Walsh lacked the experience to fully understand the implications of Harrison's intelligence update, but he possessed enough basic military training to recognize that something significant had changed about their operational environment. "What does that mean for us?" Walsh whispered to Chun, his voice carrying the kind of uncertainty that marked soldiers facing their first serious tactical challenge. "Are we supposed to continue the mission or call for extraction?" Chun glanced at Walsh with the patience of someone who remembered his own first deployment, understanding that experience was the only teacher that could fully prepare soldiers for the psychological pressure of operations in hostile territory. "It means we stay alert and do our jobs," Chun replied quietly. "Command will tell us if the mission parameters change. Until then, we stick to the plan and maintain professional focus." Sarah appreciated Chun's steady response to Walsh's anxiety, recognizing the importance of maintaining team cohesion during periods of uncertainty. Her own experience with combat stress had taught her that small teams operating in isolation depended entirely on mutual trust and professional competence when tactical situations became complicated. The calm leadership that experienced soldiers like Chun provided could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure when psychological pressure threatened to overwhelm individual performance. Sergeant Santos moved carefully among the team positions, conducting the kind of quiet coordination that characterized professional non-commissioned officers, managing complex tactical situations. Her responsibilities included not only the immediate security of their observation post, but also the broader challenge of adapting their operational approach to accommodate intelligence updates that had fundamentally changed their understanding of the threat environment. "Mitchell," Santos called softly, gesturing for Sarah to move to her position among the concealing rocks that formed their primary observation post. "I need you to expand your documentation coverage to include the northern approaches to our position. If enemy forces are moving with the kind of coordination command is suggesting, they may be attempting to establish overwatch positions that could compromise our security." The request represented exactly the kind of tactical adaptation that made Sarah's role both valuable and dangerous in equal measure. Her camera equipment possessed capabilities that exceeded standard military optics, allowing her to identify details at ranges that would be impossible with conventional observation tools. But utilizing those capabilities effectively required positioning herself in locations where she would be vulnerable to enemy observation and fire, creating the fundamental tension that characterized her participation in combat operations. Sarah began repositioning her primary camera system to cover the terrain features that Santos had identified, adjusting tripod legs and lens angles, with the mechanical precision that had become second nature through years of operational experience. The advanced stabilization systems built into her equipment allowed her to capture clear imagery even in the windy conditions that characterized high-altitude mountain operations. But setting up effective documentation positions required time and careful adjustment that could compromise team mobility if tactical situations changed rapidly. Through her telephoto lens, the northern approaches to their position came into sharp focus, revealing terrain details that had been invisible to naked eye observation from their current location. Sarah methodically scanned the ridgelines and valley floors that enemy forces might use for movement, looking for the subtle signs of human activity that could indicate tactical preparations or ongoing operations. The systematic visual search required the same kind of patience and attention to detail that characterized both professional photography and precision shooting, skills that drew from similar mental disciplines and observational techniques. "I'm seeing vehicle tracks in the valley approximately 3 kilometers north of our position," Sarah reported after completing her initial scan of the expanded coverage area. "The tracks appear recent, possibly within the last 24 hours, and they lead toward concealed positions that would provide excellent overwatch of the main supply routes we're supposed to be monitoring." Santos studied the terrain through her own binoculars, comparing Sarah's observations with the tactical map that showed known and suspected enemy positions in the operational area. The intelligence picture that was emerging suggested a level of enemy organization and preparation that exceeded the assumptions underlying their original mission planning, indicating either improved insurgent capabilities or outside support that provided access to professional military expertise. "Can you get detailed imagery of those vehicle positions?" Santos asked, understanding that photographic documentation of enemy defensive preparations could provide crucial intelligence for future coalition operations in the area. If those positions are as well prepared as they appear, Hire is going to want comprehensive analysis of their defensive capabilities and potential weaknesses. Sarah began the careful process of capturing high-resolution images that would provide intelligence analysts with the detailed information they needed to assess enemy capabilities and develop effective countermeasures. Her camera equipment could record imagery with sufficient clarity to identify individual personnel and equipment types at distances exceeding 4 kilometers. Capabilities that made her documentation efforts valuable enough to justify the risks of extended exposure in contested territory. The weight of responsibility that came with her unique capabilities pressed against Sarah's consciousness as she worked to capture the intelligence that others would use to make life-and-death decisions. Her role as a non-combatant observer placed her at the center of tactical operations while prohibiting her from directly contributing to their outcomes, creating an internal tension that grew more pronounced with each dangerous mission. She possessed skills and training that could directly impact mission success, but her official designation required her to remain passive even when active intervention might save lives. Rodriguez's voice cut through her concentration with the calm professionalism that characterized his communications under pressure. "All stations, I have movement in Sector 9. Multiple personnel moving in tactical formation toward positions that would provide direct fire capability against our current location. Estimate time to effective range at approximately 15 minutes if they maintain current movement speed." The tactical situation was developing in ways that transformed their reconnaissance mission from passive observation to active survival, requiring immediate decisions about whether to maintain their documentation objectives or prioritize team security through movement to alternative positions. Sarah understood that her equipment needs would be a significant factor in any decision about repositioning, since her camera systems required time to disassemble and reconfigure that might not be available if enemy forces establish direct observation of their location. Harrison's voice returned to the radio net with instructions that reflected the complexity of their evolving tactical situation. All stations maintain current positions and continue mission objectives until further notice. Extraction helicopter is being repositioned to provide more immediate support if required, but current priority remains intelligence gathering on enemy defensive preparations. The order to continue their mission despite increased enemy presence reflected command decisions that balanced intelligence requirements against team safety, calculations that took into account factors beyond the immediate tactical situation. Facing Sarah's team, the strategic value of the intelligence they were gathering might justify accepting higher levels of risk than would be acceptable for routine operations, especially if enemy forces were indeed preparing defensive positions that could threaten larger coalition operations in the region. Sarah felt the familiar weight of being a non-combatant in a combat situation as she continued her documentation work while enemy forces maneuvered in the valleys below their position. Her camera captured detailed imagery of personnel movements and equipment positions that would provide crucial intelligence for mission planners, but her official role prohibited her from contributing to the team's defensive capabilities in any direct way. It was a paradox that placed her simultaneously at the center of mission-critical activities and at the periphery of the tactical decisions that might determine everyone's survival. Chun's communication equipment crackled with updates from multiple sources as the tactical picture continued to evolve throughout the morning hours. Intelligence reports from other coalition units operating in adjacent areas suggested that enemy forces were conducting coordinated operations across a much broader geographic area than initially suspected, indicating either improved insurgent organization or external support that provided access to professional military planning capabilities. Phoenix Actual, this is Eagle Eye, came a transmission from aerial surveillance assets operating at higher altitudes above their position. We have eyes on multiple vehicle movements converging on your operational area. Recommend immediate assessment of extraction options and preparation for possible emergency relocation. The input from aerial surveillance confirmed Sarah's ground-based observations while adding details that painted an increasingly complex picture of enemy activities in their immediate vicinity. The convergence of multiple vehicle movements suggested either a coincidental increase in routine traffic or deliberate tactical positioning that could indicate knowledge of coalition reconnaissance activities. Either possibility carried implications that could dramatically impact their mission success and personal safety. Santos gathered the team for a quick tactical conference, bringing together the individual observations and expertise that would inform their collective response to the developing situation. The democratic approach to decision-making that characterized small unit operations reflected both the professional competence of the personnel involved and the practical reality that successful missions depended on utilizing all available expertise rather than relying solely on formal command structures. Here's what we know, Santos began, consulting notes that compiled information from multiple sources into a coherent tactical assessment. Enemy forces are moving into positions that could threaten our current location, but they may not have identified our specific position yet. Command wants us to continue intelligence gathering, but they're also positioning extraction assets in case we need immediate support. Rodriguez studied the terrain through his spotting scope, calculating fields of fire and movement options that would be available if their position was compromised. If we maintain current location, we can complete the documentation mission, but accept increased risk of detection and engagement. If we relocate now, we maintain security but may lose the opportunity to gather the intelligence that Command considers crucial for upcoming operations. The tactical dilemma reflected the fundamental challenges that characterized reconnaissance missions in contested territory. requiring teams to balance mission accomplishment against survival considerations in environments where both objectives were essential but potentially incompatible. Sarah understood that her role as the primary intelligence gathering asset made her both the most valuable and most vulnerable member of the team, creating additional complexity for tactical decisions that affected everyone's safety. Walsh listened to the discussion with the fascination of someone experiencing professional military decision-making under pressure for the first time, understanding that the choices being made would directly impact his survival while remaining beyond his ability to influence through his own expertise or experience. The educational value of observing experienced soldiers managing complex tactical situations was balanced by the uncomfortable reality that mistakes in judgment could have fatal consequences for everyone involved. I can continue documentation from this position for approximately 6 more hours before lighting conditions become inadequate. Sarah contributed to the tactical discussion, providing information about her technical capabilities that could influence timing decisions. If enemy forces continue their current approach patterns, I should be able to capture detailed intelligence about their defensive preparations before we need to consider relocation. Shun added his assessment of communication capabilities and constraints that could impact their ability to coordinate with higher headquarters and supporting assets. Current radio conditions are adequate for tactical communications, but terrain features will limit our ability to maintain contact if we move to alternative positions. Emergency extraction would require movement to designated pickup zones that could expose us to observation during transit. The complexity of their tactical situation reflected the broader challenges that characterized modern military operations in terrain that favored defending forces with intimate knowledge of local conditions. Every advantage that their position provided for intelligence gathering also created vulnerabilities that enemy forces could exploit if they identified the observation post-location. The mathematical precision that governed mountain warfare offered no perfect solutions, only choices between competing risks and uncertain outcomes. Santos made the decision that would define their immediate future with the kind of calm authority that came from years of experience with similar tactical dilemmas. We maintain current position and continue mission objectives for 4 more hours. Then reassess based on enemy movement patterns and command guidance. Rodriguez maintains overwatch security. Sheen monitors communications for any changes in guidance or support availability. And Mitchell continues intelligence documentation until further notice. The decision represented a calculated risk that balanced mission requirements against team safety in ways that reflected professional military judgment under pressure. Sarah understood that her unique capabilities had been a significant factor in the decision to remain in position, since relocating would compromise their ability to gather the intelligence that command considered essential for broader strategic objectives. As the team settled into their assigned roles for the extended observation period, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the primary reason for accepting increased tactical risk. Her documentation capabilities were valuable, enough to justify exposing the entire team to danger, but her non-combatant status meant that she could not directly contribute to their protection if the tactical situation deteriorated. It was a contradiction that would define every decision and action during the critical hours ahead, as enemy forces continued their deliberate approach toward positions that could transform their reconnaissance mission into a fight for survival. Every conversation about Sarah's training, deployment schedules, and operational assignments was filtered through Linda's desperate need to believe that her daughter would return home whole and unchanged by the violence that had consumed Tyler's dreams. The weight of that maternal hope became another burden that Sarah carried alongside her equipment into every combat zone, a constant reminder of the promises she had made and the expectations she was determined not to betray. The transformation of the Mitchell family dynamics in the aftermath of Tyler's injury had been profound and lasting. Bobby Mitchell found himself caught between pride in his daughter's service and concern that she was deliberately limiting her own potential to accommodate fears that might ultimately prove more dangerous than the risks she was trying to avoid. His own experience as a Ranger sniper had taught him that half measures in military operations often created more problems than they solved. But he also understood Sarah's motivation and respected her autonomy to make her own choices about service and sacrifice. Tyler's adjustment to civilian life had been complicated by his desire to remain connected to military operations through Sarah's experiences, creating a vicarious relationship with combat that allowed him to maintain psychological investment in outcomes he could no longer directly influence. He followed Sarah's deployments with the intensity of someone whose own military career had been cut short before reaching its full potential, living through her adventures while simultaneously worrying about her safety in ways that mirrored their mother's concerns. The sessions with military counselors and psychiatrists during Tyler's recovery had provided the Mitchell family with insights into the psychological mechanisms that drove their various responses to trauma and loss. Sarah had learned that her decision to serve in a non-combat role represented a classic example of survivor guilt compensation, an attempt to honor Tyler's sacrifice while avoiding the possibility of inflicting additional pain on a family that had already endured more than their share of military casualties. But understanding the psychological foundations of her choice had not eliminated the internal conflict that Sarah experienced during every deployment, as her natural abilities and training whispered suggestions about more direct ways to contribute to mission success and teammate protection. The tension between her chosen role and her inherited capabilities had grown stronger with each dangerous assignment, creating a pressure that she feared might eventually force her to confront choices she was not prepared to make. The leather-bound notebook that Sarah carried in her equipment pack contained more than her father's shooting calculations and range cards from Vietnam. Hidden among the technical data were personal reflections that Bobby Mitchell had written during quiet moments between missions, thoughts about the weight of responsibility that came with the ability to take life at long range and the psychological burden of making decisions that could not be undone. Reading her father's private thoughts during previous deployments had provided Sarah with insight into the moral complexity that characterized precision shooting in combat environments. Bobby Mitchell had written about the loneliness of the sniper's role, the burden of making life-and-death decisions without the emotional support that came from close teamwork, and the psychological cost of carrying responsibility for outcomes that extended far beyond individual survival. One passage from her father's notebook had stayed with Sarah through every deployment, returning to her consciousness during moments of tactical stress, when her own abilities seemed most relevant to immediate survival needs. The hardest part, Bobby had written in his precise handwriting, isn't the shooting itself. It's accepting the responsibility for consequences that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Every shot changes the world in ways that can't be predicted or controlled. The question isn't whether you can make the shot, but whether you can live with everything that follows. Those words had shaped Sarah's understanding of why Tyler's injury had been so devastating to their family's equilibrium. The consequences of his decision to serve in a combat role had indeed rippled outward like stones in still water, touching every aspect of their family relationships and future plans in ways that could never be completely repaired. Sarah's promise to serve without accepting similar risks represented an attempt to prevent additional stones from being thrown into waters that were still troubled by the wake of Tyler's sacrifice. The complexity of her internal conflict had been further complicated by the professional recognition that Sarah's documentation work had received from intelligence analysts and training specialists throughout the military system. Her footage had been used to develop tactical procedures that had saved lives in subsequent operations, proving that her non-combat role could indeed make meaningful contributions to mission success and personnel protection. But those contributions felt indirect and insufficient when she witnessed tactical situations where her shooting skills could have made immediate differences in outcomes. During her second deployment, Sarah had captured footage of an enemy sniper position that had been wreaking havoc on coalition patrols for several weeks. Her camera equipment had provided the precise location data and tactical intelligence that allowed a special operations team to neutralize the threat and save countless lives that would have been lost to continued sniper attacks. The recognition she received for that intelligence coup had been professionally satisfying, but it had also highlighted the paradox of her situation. She possessed the technical skills and natural ability to have eliminated that enemy sniper herself, but her role required her to document the problem and wait for others to solve it. The delay between identification and action had allowed the enemy sniper to kill 3 more coalition soldiers before the special operations response could be mounted. Casualties that might have been prevented if Sarah had been authorized to take direct action based on her observations. The weight of those 3 deaths had haunted Sarah through the remainder of that deployment and into her current assignment with the 3rd Infantry Division. She understood intellectually that her documentation had ultimately led to the elimination of a significant threat, but emotionally she struggled with the knowledge that her artificial limitations might have cost lives that could have been saved through more immediate action. Tyler had sensed his sister's growing internal conflict during their conversations between deployments, recognizing in her descriptions of tactical situations the same kind of professional frustration that he had experienced when bureaucratic constraints prevented optimal responses to military challenges. His attempts to provide perspective and encouragement were complicated by his own regrets about the choices that had led to his injury and the termination of his military career. Sarah, Tyler had said during one of their conversations at the ranch, his remaining hand gesturing toward the mountains that had shaped their childhood understanding of marksmanship and responsibility. "Dad didn't teach us to shoot so we could take pictures of targets. He taught us to protect what matters when protection is needed. Maybe the question isn't whether you should use those skills, but whether you can afford not to use them when lives are on the line." The conversation had taken place during Sarah's leave between her 2nd and 3rd deployments, a time when the Mitchell family was trying to process the changes that military service had brought to their relationships and expectations. Tyler's words carried the authority of someone who had paid a significant price for his own military choices, but they also reflected his understanding that his sister was deliberately limiting her potential in ways that might ultimately prove more dangerous than the risks she was trying to avoid. Bobby Mitchell had overheard that conversation from his position on the ranch house porch, understanding that his children were working through questions about duty and sacrifice that had no easy answers. His own experience had taught him that military service required individuals to find their own balance between personal limitations and mission requirements. But he also recognized that Sarah's internal conflict was reaching a level of intensity that might force resolution in ways that neither she nor her family could predict or control. Linda Mitchell's reaction to her children's discussion had been immediate and emotional, her maternal instincts transforming the theoretical conversation about military service into a practical argument about family preservation and risk management. She had interrupted their conversation with tears and pleas for Sarah to maintain her commitment to non-combat service, reminding both of her children about the price their family had already paid for military ambitions and the devastating consequences of allowing pride to override prudent caution. The scene that had unfolded on the ranch porch that evening encapsulated all of the tensions and contradictions that had shaped the Mitchell family's response to military service and personal sacrifice. Sarah found herself caught between her brother's encouragement to embrace her full potential and her mother's desperate need for security and predictability. Bobby Mitchell's silence during the argument reflected his own internal struggle between wanting his daughter to serve according to her capabilities and understanding his wife's need for reassurance about their remaining child's safety. The resolution of that family conflict had come through a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed everyone to maintain their essential positions. Sarah reaffirmed her commitment to serving in a non-combat role while acknowledging that circumstances might someday require her to adapt her approach to mission requirements. Linda Mitchell accepted her daughter's continued military service, while extracting promises about communication and safety procedures that would provide maternal reassurance. Tyler and Bobby Mitchell agreed to support Sarah's choices while maintaining their private concerns about the long-term sustainability of her self-imposed limitations. But compromises forged in the peaceful environment of a Montana ranch felt increasingly fragile when tested against the harsh realities of combat operations in Afghan mountains. Sarah's commitment to non-combat service had been made with the best of intentions and the full support of her family, but it had been made without full understanding of the tactical situations that would test her resolve and challenge her assumptions about the relationship between personal promises and professional responsibilities. The current mission represented exactly the kind of tactical environment where those theoretical limitations would be tested against practical requirements for survival and mission accomplishment. Sarah's team was operating in terrain that favored enemy forces with superior knowledge of local conditions, facing opponents whose capabilities exceeded initial intelligence estimates, and dependent on her unique documentation abilities for gathering intelligence that could impact strategic operations throughout the region. The weight of responsibility for her teammates' safety pressed against Sarah's consciousness as she continued her documentation work, while enemy forces maneuvered in the valleys below their position. Rodriguez, Santos-Chun, and Walsh were depending on her technical capabilities to provide the intelligence that justified their exposure to tactical risk, but they were also depending on each other for mutual protection in ways that her non-combatant status prevented her from fully reciprocating. The contradiction between her technical value and her tactical limitations had never been more apparent than it was during this mission, as enemy forces demonstrated capabilities and intentions that transformed routine reconnaissance into potentially life-threatening operations. Sarah's camera equipment provided eyes and ears that extended the team's situational awareness far beyond what would be possible with standard military optics, but her official role prohibited her from contributing to their defensive capabilities in ways that her training and natural abilities would allow. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Afghan mountains, Sarah found herself thinking about the promise she had made to Tyler in that hospital room 3 years earlier. The commitment to serve without accepting combat risk had seemed achievable when made in the sterile environment of a medical facility, surrounded by the evidence of military violence and family heartbreak. But that promise felt increasingly inadequate when tested against tactical situations where her teammates' survival might depend on her willingness to embrace capabilities that her role officially prohibited. The leather notebook that contained her father's reflections on the responsibility of the marksman had become more than a sentimental connection to family military tradition. It had become a tactical reference that provided guidance for decisions that Sarah had hoped never to face, but which seemed increasingly inevitable as enemy forces continued their deliberate approach toward positions that could compromise her team's security and mission success. Bobby Mitchell's words about accepting responsibility for consequences that rippled outward, like stones in water, had taken on new meaning as Sarah contemplated the potential outcomes of maintaining her non-combatant status versus embracing the combat capabilities that her training and instincts suggested might be necessary for mission success and teammate protection. The choice between honoring her promise to Tyler and her mother versus accepting responsibility for tactical decisions that could determine whether her teammates survived their current mission represented exactly the kind of moral complexity that her father had warned about in his private writings. The psychological burden of carrying such choices into combat operations was exactly what Sarah had hoped to avoid through her selection of a non-combat military role. But the mountains of Afghanistan had a way of stripping away artificial distinctions and forcing individuals to confront the fundamental question of what they were willing to sacrifice for what they valued most. As enemy forces continued, their approach and tactical options became increasingly limited. Sarah began to understand that some promises could only be kept at the cost of betraying other commitments that might prove even more important when tested. Under the extreme pressure of life and death situations, the weight of her father's notebook in her equipment pack served as a constant reminder that military service sometimes required individuals to grow beyond the limitations they had placed on themselves, accepting responsibilities that extended far beyond personal comfort or family expectations. The question that would define the remainder of her deployment was whether Sarah Mitchell possessed the courage to become the soldier that her teammates needed, even if it meant breaking the promises that had shaped her understanding of service and sacrifice for the past 3 years. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.